Okay, here's our video today. Hemocyanin and hemoglobin. Hemocyanin versus hemoglobin. So one is what humans and most vertebrates use to carry oxygen and bring back carbon dioxide. And hemocyanin does it also. And so the key thing with this is you'll find in hemoglobin, it's red blood. Let's write that down. Red blood because of the iron. And we'll talk about that. So this is red blood. And if you have hemocyanin, and well, let's change the color for that. Well, we can't really. Blue blood, right? There's the difference. And so they have similar purposes. They transport oxygen, O2. That's what they're transporting, O2, which is oxygen. It's just two oxygen molecules. And they also transport CO2. CO2, carbon dioxide. When oxygen binds to hemoglobin, it turns red. But when it binds to hemocyanin, it turns blue. So you have the blue bloods and the red bloods. So, and we'll talk about this in the video, like, for example, the blue-blooded creatures would be like lobsters and horseshoe crabs. We can fit them in. Horseshoe crabs, put it right there. We'll talk about horseshoe crabs in this video, actually, because there's an interesting thing about what humans do with their blood. So first we'll talk about hemoglobin. We'll talk about what's happening in our bodies, and then we'll go to hemocyanin. So when we're talking about hemoglobin, there's our circle. We're talking about the red blood cell. Because the red blood cell carries hemoglobin, and it's the hemoglobin that oxygen will attach to and CO2. And you can see on this red blood cell here, it looks like it has space. If I just change the color, there's a lot of space so it can carry the hemoglobin. Because red blood cells don't carry DNA. So they're the only cells in our body that don't have DNA of the 36 trillion cells that we do have. You can think of red blood cells like trucks. Think of them as trucks. They're picking up this material. So in the lungs, we have these tiny air sacs, the alveoli. Sounds like some pasta dish, right? These tiny air sacs is where the oxygen diffuses from the air into the bloodstream. So once in the bloodstream, these red blood cells you're seeing here, they're going to pick up the O2. Remember, it's two oxygen atoms. That's why it's O2. Which we breathe in. We breathe in the O2. Think of this oxygen that's coming into the blood as tourists when you're on a trip and you're waiting for the shuttle van to bring you to the hotel. Well, the red blood cells are the trucks carrying hemoglobin, and the O2 is like the tourists, and they'll attach themselves to the hemoglobin, and the red blood cells will carry them through the bloodstream to every cell in your body. And so the key ingredient, of course, in hemoglobin, put it over here, is iron. And iron can bond with 4 oxygen molecules. They can bond, say it over here, they bind with 4 O2 molecules. And each red blood cell you're seeing here has 270 million hemoglobin molecules. See if I can fit it in there. So you can see how much oxygen one red blood cell can carry. One red blood cell can carry 1.08 billion O2 molecules. And remember, O2 has 2 oxygen atoms, so that's 2.16 billion oxygen, but O atoms. Just fit. One has a lot of oxygen. Let's just think about all the red blood cells we have. Okay. By the way, why iron anyway? Well, iron, first of all, it's readily available, and it could form bonds easily. It could form oxygen bonds better than any other element. And not only could it bonds with this oxygen, it also could release it when needed. And we'll talk about that release when needed. So oxygen is definitely the most efficient element. And of course, we evolved to have iron in other animals, to have iron in our blood if we are red blood celled creatures. So let me get a blank page and we'll talk about the Bohr effect. And we'll say the Bohr effect. So what happens is when a red blood cell, let's say that's a red blood cell, and let's say it has gotten to a cell, and the red blood cells are carrying O2. So we'll just say O2. O2. They're carrying all this oxygen. And so when they reach the cells, what the cells are releasing in the outside the cell, they're releasing CO2. They're releasing that waste. They're trying to get rid of the CO2. And so when the red blood cell with the oxygen, of course the hemoglobin, on that, it'll become more acidic. The area will become more acidic. CO2 will make the cell more acidic. And that's the key right there. CO2, carbon dioxide, will make the cell more acidic. And what this does then is the CO2 is released, the hemoglobin will then have an affinity to pick it up and release the oxygen. And then the oxygen, of course, will diffuse into the cell. Now, the red blood cells that now have picked up the oxygen, because the CO2 combined with hemoglobin also, the red blood cells will follow the river of blood, the bloodstream, back to the heart, back into the lungs. And back into the lungs now we have the fusion again, so let's explain diffusion if we need to. And why not? Diffusion appears a lot. So with diffusion, you can go from a high concentration of a substance without energy to a low concentration. And this, again, I said, has no energy required. It's just passive transport. So if we pretend this is our lungs, little fancy design of our lungs, if there's a lot of CO2 outside the lungs, a limited supply inside, of course, remember I said from high to low, the molecules will move. So they'll move into the lungs by this diffusion. And of course then they'll be exhaled out into, and the plants would love that. Oxygen is inhaled, and of course CO2 is exhaled. Okay, so let's erase this and now get to hemocyanin, which of course is in blue-blooded creatures. So we'll clear all that out. And I'll make a little chart here. What should we use? Green? Why not? So we got hemocyanin. And then we'll just put a little line down, and then we'll say hemoglobin. So hemoglobin, as we said before, is iron-based. Iron-based. And iron could bond with 4 oxygen molecules, whereas hemocyanin is copper-based. And hemoglobin will make the blood is red, like we said before. And I mentioned before that the blood, for anyone having hemocyanin, will be blood is blue. And we said, like the lobsters. and the horseshoe crabs. So what's the advantage? Well, hemoglobin is good for high oxygen environments. More efficient for carrying oxygen, whereas hemocyanin is good for low oxygen environments, where you find these lobsters on the bottom of the ocean and the horseshoe crabs. So if the lobsters and horseshoe crabs had hemoglobin, it wouldn't be an efficient carrier to bring that oxygen. See, when hemoglobin has limited oxygen, the oxygen will bind tightly to the hemoglobin, and that makes it hard to release. So it's much more efficient if lobsters and horseshoe crabs have hemocyanin. Now what you're seeing here, these are horseshoe crabs, and you can see their blue blood is being drained in this factory here, and this may have some ethical consequences that we can talk about, but not in this video. But anyway, have horseshoe crabs been harmed in this video? Some say no, but some say yes. Some say that 90% survive when they're draining them of blood. Seems kind of disturbing in this way, but why are they even draining them of blood? Because the hemocyanin, there seems to be a lot of benefits with bacterial detection, that they can use this in medicine. In fact, a quart of this stuff could be worth $10,000. So you can see why they're trying to factorize, well, if that's even a word, they're using these, trying to get this blue blood out of horseshoe crabs. And again, you can also find them, like we said before, in lobsters and squid and octopus. They have this blood, but it seems like horseshoe crabs have a finer blue that may have more benefits. So again, just to review, hemoglobin is what most vertebrates have, and of course hemoglobin attaches to the red blood cell. It has iron in it that when oxygen is attached to it, makes the blood red, a red color, whereas what you're seeing here will turn it blue because it's copper based. Hemocyanin is copper based, and the copper will turn the oxygen blue. That's why you see it there. And again, hemocyanin is better for a low oxygenated environment, the bottom of the lakes and oceans, where hemoglobin is better for a high concentration of oxygen in us. All right, that's our video today.